guys for being here. And I am excited because, as Rob has pointed out, the title is very long because I'm actually presenting on a project. Okay, so I will focus on one paper, but this is actually part of like a body of work, and wanted to highlight the different angles that we're taking with that work through this project, but that made for a really long title. So also want to acknowledge before I get started that I've been doing this work with Dr. Sandy Zook, who some of you know, and we've also been working with an undergraduate student at OSU, Aisha Chowdhury, who is getting ready to graduate, who has presented with us at Arnova. She's a computer science and engineering student, and I will talk about her involvement as we go through. So I thought it would be fun, since I don't get to talk about this part of the project very often, to just mention the origins of this project. So Sandy has done a lot of work in Ghana. We were working on a project together. Through her relationships there, she had gained access to the NGO registration forms that are collected by the Ministry of, I'm going to blank on the name, it's like Women something and something. But these are paper-based registration processes, or paper-based forms. And they also come in duplicate from like 7 different regions of the country. So it's a pretty complicated task to try to do anything with them. And our goal was to map the NGO sector in Ghana. And based on what we're going to talk about today, we developed an early conceptual framework that is, we were asked to, if we wanted to contribute to a peer-edited volume on critical AI studies, and our piece was accepted. What I'm going to be presenting today is primarily in this space. So we've got an R&R at Public Administration for a special issue on ethical, responsible, and value-oriented use of artificial intelligence. And I'm presenting the next piece of this at an MPSA pre-conference on politics of AI. So this is an ongoing project, and but just wanted to kind of give you a chance to see the lineage of it. Okay. Are you going to need to click?
Yeah, it was going to work.
Okay, there we go. It is working. Okay, so the puzzle that we started to notice is that as we dug into the AI governance literature, there was a lot of kind of superficial calling out for, we need more stakeholder engagement, especially for marginalized populations. And we know, as public affairs folks, that one of the ways that that's traditionally happened is through nonprofits or civil society organizations more broadly. But there was very little engagement with any of the research on nonprofits or civil society. There wasn't really any discussion about what activities they might be doing to kind of help involve marginalized stakeholders in AI governance. So that is where we really saw this is a space that we can contribute something important to. So when we say AI governance, what we're talking about is not just regulation. Okay, we're also talking about norms, institutions, about the development, oversight, and use of AI. And this goes through all levels of analysis. So this is about individually how I might be using AI and making decisions. This goes to organizational policies and culture, and this goes to public policy and even like international norms and policy. I don't think I need to define stakeholders, but there is a definition up there if you'd like it. And when I'm talking about civil society organizations, in the US context, we typically talk about them as nonprofits. But these are groups of people who come together voluntarily because they have a common interest, and they're not managed by the state, and they can operate at also any level of analysis. Now, when I say not-for-profit, a lot of us in the US context automatically think 501c3 charity. If you're not familiar with that designation, that's still what you're probably thinking about. We're also including a variety of other organizations in our analysis, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So our research questions, in the chapter that I just mentioned, we were conceptually trying to conceptualize how do different civil society organization roles align with dominant AI governance approaches, and I'll talk about both of those, the frameworks that we drew on to think about both of those things and how we integrated them in a second. The paper I'm going to be focusing on is, okay, looking at organizational language of mission statements and activity descriptions of nonprofits in the US. Which of these AI governance approaches do we kind of find there, and also which public value roles are they talking about? And based on that analysis, our next step is, what are some of the kind of we're calling them profiles here, but you could also think of them as clusters, like groups of organizations based on their activities that are kind of emblematic of the ways that civil society organizations are contributing to AI governance. And how does their access to resources maybe give some indications about how they can contribute to AI governance? So our research design was abductive because we started with integrating two theories, two frameworks that I'll talk about in a second, but then we refined that framework based on empirical data. So we're really equally favoring theory and empirical data to come up with novel insights, and then applying that framework empirically. Okay, so let's talk about dominant AI governance approaches. So there are different typologies that people have come up with. We chose to work with the one that Stark, Green, and Hoffman had developed because it took more of a critical perspective. So it was specifically thinking about there's a lot of discussion of stakeholders and who is actually engaged in these different approaches. So when we're talking about a tools-based approach, this is where algorithms are actually designed to include some sort of mechanism that is in the space of AI governance. So this could include things like, I don't know if you've ever asked ChatGPT if it is sentient, okay? But it will give a canned response because there's something built into the algorithm that if somebody puts in a prompt that is asking that, then it will give a specific answer. The engineers are not just going to let it answer however it wants to, okay? So that would be an example of a tools-based solution. Principles are normative statements. So you might remember that a few years ago there were some really highly publicized letters that came out that were signed by very high-profile people who were either currently working or had just resigned from big tech firms, talking about the risks of AI. Okay, so that would kind of be in the space of principles. So trying to shape normatives, make normative statements. But there have also been a number of statements that were put out by big tech firms, for example, about what they are saying, this is what normatively we are adhering to, but there's no teeth to this, right? It's all normative. There are regulations and standards. So regulations, I think we're mostly familiar with in here. Standards are, there are independent bodies that are usually nonprofits that set standards for technology. And so these are things like, all plugs have to be made in this particular way, right? And so there is more third-party oversight because there can be kind of stamps of approval, like this meets the standard, this doesn't meet the standard. AI governance within a human rights framework is essentially trying to use human rights law to govern AI. So taking more of a legal, case-based approach. And securitization is where AI governance is very focused on issues related to national security. Okay, so this is going to be country by country. So any questions about these different approaches? Okay, so this was the framework that we were drawing on when we were thinking about dominant AI governance approaches. In terms of a civil society framework, there are a lot of different ways that we could have gone with this. And some of you, like Juan, will be super familiar with this, I'm sure. We ultimately decided for this project to draw on Moulton and Eckert. So Stephanie Moulton, thank you so much for that. But this is a typology of nonprofits. But what was important to us is that it was within kind of a policy implementation infrastructure. So because we're interested in governance, this was a good fit for us. So this includes, for our first publication, grouped this a little bit differently, but it includes a recognition of direct service, which a lot of us will be familiar with. This is where most 501c3s would or a lot of 501c3s would fit in. But there's also what we're calling policy advocacy. Originally, it was political advocacy, but we broadened this because what we noticed is that there was a lot of engagement trying to shape more like public opinion, as well as some involvement in bringing suit against different entities. And so we wanted to broaden this to policy advocacy. And then we've got a bridging role, which Moulton and Eckert describe as including social capital creation, so ties between people as well as individual expression and citizen engagement. So it encompasses a lot of different things, and we refined this a little bit that I'll talk in the ways that I'll talk about in a little bit. So this was our original framework that was published in the chapter. So you can see it's integrating the two frameworks, okay, and starting to think about what would these look like, right? But this was, again, conceptual and based on, examples that we found a little bit ad hoc, as well as like newspaper coverage that we were encountering. So what we decided to do next is to refine this framework empirically. Okay, so this is where the abduction comes in. And so what we did is we pulled all the 990 forms for tax year 2021. We chose that tax year because there's usually a lag in when the IRS releases the full data set, and so we wanted to make sure we had a full data set. We also wanted to get something that was a tax year that was kind of right on the cusp of what we were seeing, this explosion of AI. So in that data, for organizations that e-filed, so these are automatically larger organizations, okay, slightly larger organizations over 50,000 in assets. They are required to submit mission and activity descriptions. Okay, so that's primarily what we're going to be focusing our analysis on today. But these forms also include assets, revenues, and advocacy expenditures. So we'll talk about our future ideas for how we're going to use that data. And in terms of the types of civil society organizations, we do have public charities, but also advocacy, labor and agriculture, business leagues, okay, because a lot of these are important because these also include even our professional membership organizations, right? And so IEEE, which is one of the big engineering associations, is encompassed here, so we want to make sure that we got those. And then we also had social clubs because we weren't entirely sure if we were going to capture anything. All right, so our first step was we needed a way, this got us about, if I'm remembering correctly, 300,000 organizations. Okay, we're not going to go through all of those by hand. And we don't want to limit it to the organizations that we already know are engaged in AI governance. So what we did is there was a list that Ezra actually pointed me to of responsible tech organizations. And these are organizations that self-identified in this way and provided a brief description that was probably a mix of mission and activity description. So we mined that data set for the most frequently occurring words, which gave us this. And this was our initial list of seed words that we then applied to the data from the 990 forms, so the mission and activity descriptions, to identify possible, potential organizations that could be engaged in some way in AI governance. And we then kind of qualitatively inspected that round. We also identified other frequently occurring words within that first round of data set, that first poll, to identify other words that were kind of adjacent to our original seed list. So we went through this iterative process of basically using automated content analysis to identify a list of organizations that, again, may be involved in AI governance. Okay, so that gave us over 5,000 organizations to look at. So then, Sandy and I, by hand, both of us, went through every single one of those mission and activity descriptions and whittled it down to 1,700, or about 1,700 CSOs who we classified based on our refined framework, which we refined through the qualitative coding process, as being engaged in some way in AI governance. And we'll talk about ways that they can be engaged in a little bit. So we classified them based on both, first of all, whether or not they were engaged at all. Okay, then we classified them based on what approaches they were engaged in, because they're not mutually exclusive. And then we classified them based on what roles, but really it boiled down to what activities are they engaged in. So the roles are classified based on the activities that they actually described. Yes?
Sorry. Approximately how long are the mission
activity descriptions? So we had, there were 3 mission description fields, and then there are, I think, 3 other activity description fields.
Merged them together.
No, we kept them separate, but we considered them comprehensively in terms of like how we were classifying the organization. And I would say all told, under 200 words probably. Well, no, that's not right. They range a lot, Neil. I actually should have that, like I should pull that data of how long the descriptions were. Some of them are very, very short, like 25 words. Some of them
the mission, I could imagine.
Well, the activity descriptions are some of them got very, very long. Yeah. So I shouldn't even say 200 because thinking about those, some of them probably would be about a page.
Where I was going to link that is that other list that you said, that's where they self-disclose, but do they also report any activities on that?
So they self-disclosed and they provided brief description, but again, this was only our initial seed list.
So you haven't done a comparison to what they're promoting themselves to?
No, because our goal with this was to refine our framework.
Yeah.
But moving forward, what this is going to allow us to do is then compare across different data sets, because we can now link this with the EIN, right, the employee identification number, to different kinds of data sets, or the organization name.
Or type. Thank you.
Okay, so we went through this classification process, we refined our typology, and the last thing I'm going to be presenting on today are qualitatively identified profiles. So these are just based on patterns that we noticed in the data. But our next step is actually to take more of a quantitative approach to identifying clusters, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so findings. First thing that we noticed is that the Stark, Green, and Hoffman framework, well, we originally it included the pieces in yellow. Okay. What we noticed is that in the US context, there was just not a lot of discussion of human rights. Even sustainable development goals, which is they're very closely connected to human rights. But there was a lot of discussion about equity and justice. Okay. And trying to connect with different marginalized populations, trying to equip different communities or individual students, for example, who are underrepresented in computer science, for example, and bring them, give them opportunities in this space. And then the other thing that we decided to add, because this came out a little bit after their framework, is that there was starting to be more and more discussion about environmental concerns with artificial intelligence. And so we decided to add it. And as I'll talk about in a little bit, we didn't find, it was not at all well represented in our sample, but we decided to keep it anyways because we think that moving forward, that's going to change. Ultimately, we decided because human rights wasn't well represented, we originally coded this as two separate things, we decided to combine them. Okay. So that is one finding. In terms of the kinds of activities that were described and how they map onto the roles. So again, we had these, the original way that we consolidated a little bit, Moulton and Eckerd, was direct service, advocacy, and bridging. As we got into our qualitative coding, what we noticed is that direct service, we thought that we needed to differentiate between direct service provision to individuals and communities versus what we call backbone organizations. So these are organizations that provide funding, that act as that collect data and then govern how that data gets used by a network. I'm trying to think of what else. Organizations that are hubs for other organizations in some way is backbone. Okay.
And accreditation organizations too?
Yeah, I think accreditation organizations would have been classified. Well, accreditation, if they're certifying diplomas.
Oh, right, because that would be a service.
Then that would be direct service. Yeah. But if they're accrediting an institution, we had to get very specific about the language to be able to hold this, right? Okay. So under advocacy, as I kind of hinted at before, this is where we put legal representation because there was some discussion of this already. certainly policy advocacy and public opinion. What we also noticed is that it made sense to classify knowledge creation here. So this is what we're engaged in, or a lot of us in this room. Okay, so this is where think tanks, like some of that activity would be captured here. Okay, and then in terms of bridging, we've got social capital. So this would be associations are covered by this space. Individual expression is any organizations that were helping to facilitate, for example, entrepreneurship in the AI space, or education in the AI space, because that's about me as an individual learning skills to be able to express my career goals in the world. This is where we classified this. Okay. And then public engagement was convening stakeholders, and this could be either individual or organizational, okay, to engage in some sort of shared problem and solution ideation and decision making. All right, so this is our refined framework. And then in terms of the activities, we can go in depth into, I'll go in depth into a couple of these because I think we have time. So I think I would like to focus on tools just because I think because of maybe some of our own cognitive biases, including my own about the nonprofit sector, we don't often think about how are they going to be contributing to tools. But we have, the inventor of ChatGPT is a nonprofit. I don't know if you guys know this. So we have those kinds of organizations that are kind of using nonprofit legitimacy maybe in particular ways. So even though they have business entities, they've got maybe umbrella organizations. We also have a lot of universities involved in this space and a lot of hospitals involved in this space that are engaged in AI governance, especially collectively. Okay. And we decided that there were some organizations, this is one thing we weren't expecting to find necessarily, but they're curating data sets explicitly for training better AI models. So they want to facilitate cancer research, for example. And nobody is actually doing the work of collecting all of that data in order to be able to train a good model. And so they're stepping in and doing that job. All right. Principles, as we'll talk about quantitatively in a little bit, was by far the way that this subsector of organizations is contributing to AI governance. So they're very involved in shaping norms, shaping values, shaping discourse around AI, which makes sense because those are things that we often attribute to the nonprofit sector, and that is what we found here. So this, for us, this in terms of activities, this looked like anything that involved education, we decided to interpret as socialization. So these are essentially saying, hey, these are the terms that you need to be aware of. These are the issues that you need to be aware of, and starting to set that foundation of norms that's going to carry people through, whether it's at the elementary level or all the way up to higher education. So that's where we coded this. If they had regular workshops and trainings or certifications, then we coded it here. If it was a one-off, we said that is not AI governance. Okay? And then diffusion of best practices and shared values. So again, this is where associations are going to fall under this as well. Okay. Regulations and standards. This is political policy work as well as organizations like the International Standards Organization, and there are state level and even local level chapters of that are again setting these highly technical standards that are also nonprofits. And then you asked about the difference, right? This is where accreditation of programs and degrees comes in. Okay, and then securitization. We were not necessarily expecting there to be so many nonprofits engaged in this space as well, but there are, okay, because there are a lot of organizations that are involved in helping to develop national security technology. There are organizations that are providing, lots of organizations that are providing cybersecurity, like certificates, trainings, all those kinds of things. There are professional membership organizations. There are organizations that are managing public and private information sharing. So how do we help protect ourselves against cybersecurity threats? That's something the nonprofit sector is engaged in because they don't have a financial stake in as all of their individual member organizations might, so they can be kind of the more neutral arbitrator between them. And then, of course, efforts to shape public policy through direct advocacy, public opinion, and case law. Okay, human rights, I will not, oops, and this should also say human rights and equity justice because we did combine them. Does top one. So this is, there are organizations that are specifically focused on how do we develop technology that is, or like AI tools that specifically take into consideration equity and justice, okay? And so in that case, that organization would be coded here, and it would be coded to tools, for example. But we also have lots of stuff in the education space, so specifically targeting different groups that, again, are underrepresented in the field. And the thinking there is along the lines of representative bureaucracy. Okay, so around the time that we were developing our original framework, there were also a few very high-profile resignations from big tech firms of people of color who were either developing technology or in the division of the firm that was supposed to be basically doing responsible or ethical AI management, like helping the organization to develop responsible and ethical AI. And they resigned, and the way that they described their choice to resign was very specifically in reference to this is going to harm, these marginalized groups of which I identify. Okay, so that was some of the thinking here. Lots of professional membership organizations that are geared towards different, again, underrepresented groups. Facilitating inclusive deployment, so helping to empower individuals to make better choices. Again, associations here, and then, again, direct advocacy, case law, and public opinion here. Okay, and then last thing, environmental sustainability. So I would say that this part of our framework is maybe the least refined, just because there was not a lot of representation here. Okay, so a lot of this language you'll notice kind of mirrors the language in the other pieces. And it'll be interesting to see how this evolves over time. Okay, so as I alluded to, these organizations were involved in multiple approaches, often, and multiple roles. Okay, so these are not mutually exclusive classifications, any of them. Okay, they could be involved in multiple approaches and multiple roles. So the next thing that we're engaged in is, this is where the idea of profiles kind of comes out of, is what patterns are we seeing in terms of an organization is this and this. Okay, so one of the patterns that we saw is, again, you can see a whole lot of principles here, right? Like 97% of the organizations were contributing to principles in some way. But principles through direct provision, individual expression, and social capital. And based on what I said before, everybody want to take a guess about what kind of organizations we might be talking about? Remember that individual expression, we also connected that to career goals, right? And so professional membership services was one of these. Okay? So they're building social capital because, again, they're these associations, but they're individual expression because the associations are also, like for us, kind of instrumental in advancing people's careers, right, and helping them to move forward. But this is also training, education, and workforce development. Okay, so both of these were encompassed here. And then we also have, when we bring in this additional approach of equity and justice, this is where we get kind of diversity, equity, inclusivity, accessibility. So organizations that are engaged in working with specific marginalized groups to build connections, to educate, to provide those direct services, and contributing in both of these approaches to AI governance. And we also have, so shifting from a direct service approach to more of a backbone approach. So here we've got member universities, right? So this is an umbrella organization that's bringing together a coalition of higher education universities. And they're engaged in knowledge creation, right? Because they're doing research. They are also, because they're publishing scientific studies that are kind of generally available, they're influencing public opinion. They also, I can't remember if it's here. In their activities descriptions, they sometimes go into more detail, which is why we code them to public policy as well. Okay, so when we get to tools, this is another place where we've got a lot of research happening, as I kind of alluded to earlier. So OpenAI is the organization that I couldn't think of before because it's lunchtime and I need to have more coffee. But this is, again, the inventor of ChatGPT that is here and engaged in direct service provision because people can pay for its services individually, and knowledge creation because it's engaged in research. We've got, as I mentioned before, lots of medical research happening in this space. So this is everything, lots of individual, lots of cancer research, lots of research focused on specific diseases. This is where you get the efforts to try to build data sets that are where the data would be difficult to collect. And so people have to kind of come together to fund it. So these are a few of the profiles that we felt kind of confident highlighting at this point. We expect that others may emerge when we do our next steps. So next steps for us are lightened class analysis, which is a good one to use with qualitative coding in terms of identifying patterns, but in a more quantitative way. And so that we can more comprehensively group organizations together by the activities that they're engaged in. And then we're really interested to see, based on those groupings, how organizational assets maybe suggests that that these different activities have different implications for AI governance and what civil society is able to contribute to AI governance. So for example, I would expect that organizations in taking a tools approach, I think that this is going to be the dominant place where a lot of resources are focused, right? Because you've got medical research, you have the outliers like an OpenAI that are in that space. Whereas equity and justice and even regulations and standards are probably going to be dwarfed. And environment right now is completely dwarfed because it's just not even represented. All right, and then longer term, even beyond what the papers that I outlined at the beginning of this presentation, what we're planning to do is we were very, very careful and took a completely traditional qualitative coding approach to this because we wanted to be very confident that we'd established a foundation of ground truth that we could build on. Because the idea is then to use large language model prompting to apply these classifications to other years of data. So we can actually look over time and see how activities in the nonprofit sector that are connected to AI governance, shift or change, or how the distribution of resources across those activities shifts and changes over time. So that is kind of where we're at right now. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your reactions to this research and any questions that you might have. So thank you.
Yeah. That last bullet. So the way I was hearing it, forgive me because I came in late, you might have said it at the beginning. It's about practice or opportunities, it's about activities, but not potential without outcomes.
Well, there are
some outcomes mixed in, things like the training and the standard development, but it's about engagement rather than consequence.
Well, these are the mission statements and activity descriptions from their 990 forms. So we're, in that sense, we're limited to what they are reporting, but the advantage of that data set is that it is longitudinal.
Sure, but so then, are you thinking about trying to find outcomes in future years and link that to prior investments in these activities?
It would depend on the outcomes. Like some of them, you know, like the educational outcomes, I think would be really hard to connect to these data. But we've already started talking to a different research team that has been doing more work in who engages in administrative rulemaking around AI, or who engages in like policy advocacy.
The expert,
right.
witness.
And so again, they were not aware of the 990 data at all, which is interesting. And so connecting data sets is part of the reason that we definitely think that there's a future to that. We just need to be strategic about, you know, who we're partnering with, because we don't want to learn every new data set as well. But I think that there are opportunities there.
Very, very cool research agenda, very impressive data as well. Also related to that last bullet point about the longitudinal observations, as our nonprofit community learned recently that we don't even have full access to the 2022 data yet, so it might take a while for you to like really replicate this study using more recent data. But I was thinking that your actual final sample for this study is only, I mean, it's still a large number, but it's only 1,700 organizations. So not necessarily exactly for this paper, but I think it will be, instead of waiting for the full 990 data, it might be worth just looking at those 1,700 organizations, like as of this moment, like, you know, going to their website or things like that. Because, I mean, as you kind of hinted at, the mainstream interest in AI didn't really take off until like late 2022 when OpenAI released, I think, the first version of ChatGPT, right? So it would be really cool to see what those like 1,700 like OGs are doing these days after those years.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And there's no, I mean, there's so many papers that I think we could do from this.
Yes.
We're trying to I've outlined a couple of ideas that we just are the next kind of low-hanging fruit for us where we want to go with this, because the activities, I did not include our actual code book, but it is very, very detailed. And so that it was a really big lift to get everything in there. We weren't necessarily expecting all the different activities to be, and we weren't sure what we were going to find. So, but yeah, it's a great idea to just track of the organizations we know, because it's like just tracking with EINs, that becomes pretty easily. Ashley and then Stephanie.
So on the slide with the data, could you go back to that for a second? So this was of the 1,700?
Yes.
Okay, so this framework, could you apply it to the 3,000 or so more that were initially classified from the keyword search? Because you said you had whittled the sample, like you'd done the
Because
keyword
they were
search.
not involved in AI governance.
Okay.
Yeah, but we excluded them because they're not involved. So for example, so just as one example, in the not the higher education space, but do I have it here? Like this space, STEM, as in like science, technology, engineering, and math, and STEAM, so science, technology, engineering, math, and or like arts is in there. Okay, that's where the STEM becomes STEAM. So that through this iterative process, that became one of our keywords, right? But that would also capture stem cell research, right? So stem cell research is not inherently AI governance. There were some instances where people were using artificial intelligence to do stem cell research, right? But if they were excluded, it's because they were not engaged in anything that we recognized as an AI governance activity. So this would be, that's why moving forward, it is we're pretty confident at this point that we've identified the organizations that submitted their 990 forms for the 2021 tax year that mentioned something related to what we're interested in. But moving forward then, like we've got the EINs of the organizations that we identified before, but then we would expect other organizations probably to be picking up or forming, right? And there's also, even though they're technically required to submit 990s every year, not all nonprofits do. And so there's some fluctuation from year to year in that regard as well.
So I was going to ask you a little bit about the sample. This was great, and I think there's like 10 papers here. So the responsible tech orgs, I was really curious about the overlap. You said Ezra gave you this list of responsible tech orgs, but that's not what you limited it to. You just, you used the definitions or yeah, how did the keywords that you came up with were from the responsible tech orgs?
The original seed list.
The original seed list. Okay, gotcha.
So, and that was, so they're a very, very small group of people that or organizations that self-identified as responsible tech. And that list was also multi-sector. So you could be any kind of organization and identify as a responsible tech organization. So it didn't make sense for us to take that approach. And I mean, actually that it kind of also points to one of the things that I think is distinct about the way that we chose to approach our research project and other things that I'm kind of hearing about. So I think there have been I know there have been other efforts to identify organizations involved in AI governance, but it's been, they had to be visible enough for people to kind of recognize them in that space, whereas we took a really ground up, like inductive, because somebody who's involved in, who is, like I come from the city of Detroit, right? So if someone is providing girls coding classes in the city of Detroit, they would be in our data set, right? Because we're saying you're helping to establish those norms for the next generation of people that are that you're trying to equip to some of whom are going to go into this industry, right? And then they're going to be making choices about tools and like what principles are important and whether or not we should be adhering to them. That's not going to be picked up on these bigger approaches because those organizations themselves don't necessarily identify as like we are part of this bigger picture of AI governance.
Right. And that kind of feeds my second question. I think there's a cool thing you could do here. It's almost like a third layer, but are these organizations that exist for AI, like OpenAI? Like, did they get created? Are these nonprofit organizations that actually, like, it's essential to their mission? It's like the central part versus American Medical Association, which I'm guessing probably, maybe, I don't know if they're in here, but like, it seems like they might be, because they might be doing some stuff about, ethical use of medical data. I don't know. And yeah, so I wonder if you're able to kind of just tease apart. I mean, it's like literally the organization exists because of this versus it's something like the American Medical Association.
So, I mean, we could certainly do an automated content analysis for like anybody who has AI in their mission statement, I think is one way that you could do that. But another reason that we took this approach is for folks that work with the 990 data, the dominant classification for nonprofits is the NTE codes.
Yeah, I was thinking about the NTE codes.
And they have nothing about AI, right? Because AI didn't exist when the NTE codes were developed. And so there's been more research in nonprofit studies that is even like, well, the NTE codes are problematic because if I am an organization serving unhoused folks, I could be serving them through
social service, housing, there's all kinds of NTE codes you could pick.
Right. Yeah, so if I look at mission statement language versus the NTE codes, I'm going to capture a lot more organizations than only the NTE codes.
Yes.
And let alone if I am looking at an activity area that literally didn't exist. Right? Yeah. There was no other way to capture this. Like we kind of have to build it in some way.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think.
So I don't think you'd use NTE code, but I think something about like, is this organization, is AI in the name? Like, does it exist for that purpose?
Yeah.
Or not? And then if the ones that don't exist for that purpose, I think like probably later. This is like paper number 10, but this idea of like almost a heat map of what are the areas where we need more like this subsector of the nonprofit area that's doing housing, for example, they aren't talking, there doesn't seem to be any nonprofits active. This subsector that's talking about, engineering training, they're all over it, like just trying to get at.
So the profiles paper that we're talking about, I've mentioned a couple times resources, but we're planning to do a heat map based on NTE code.
That's great,
just to get some sense of how engagement at all in AI is mapped across the traditional activity areas of the nonprofit sector. So this, it's not quite outcomes, but it's maybe like starting to point in this direction. Like where are organizations even voluntarily investing?
Yeah, and again, that could be that's where the longitudinal will come in, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, that'll be super cool.
I mean, we played at this of sort of like when there was a practice versus promise is the language we were using, where we're saying, look, we're committing to doing this. Then when a year or two later, were we actually able to accomplish anything in sustainability stuff? Right?
So I don't know. I mean, we'll have to think about that at the organization level. I was thinking more like, because we also have addresses, like geographic addresses, right? So if you have a concentration of organizations, nonprofits involved in AI governance in particular states, what does that mean for like AI regulation in that states, for example? Because what's happening right now in the US is the federal government, so far it hasn't pulled back from the kind of standard setting. So like for years, the federal government has engaged industry. This is the National Institute for Standards and Technology in developing frameworks for responsible AI use. Okay, so they haven't like taken those down or anything like that. But at the same time, the Trump administration is signaling very, very clearly that it is not interested in AI regulation at the federal level, and that even it will come after some state and local jurisdictions if they try to implement AI governance. And so that becomes a really interesting space for like what influence do these organizations have. And I know Ezra's done some of this work as well, but we didn't see a ton of discussion about AI in terms of legal representation. There was some though. And that is a means through which they can potentially influence policy, like not just through like political or policy advocacy in a traditional way. Yes, Dylan.
On the intersection of the political aspect of this, I've been thinking the whole time, I guess this is a two-part question. On the 990 forms, the e-file, every time they go to e-file, they have the opportunity, I guess, to change their mission statement and the activities. Okay. So I'm curious, as the data pushes right, and we've seen, right, the introduction of the AI czar and kind of these normative diffusion and of dialogue of, AI, but also diversity and equity and inclusion and how that, right? So I'm curious, right, when you get data to the right now, where does, that whole row bleed into? Because I'm sure, right, firms submitting these documents to the federal government, if it'd be interesting on the e-file if it pre-populates last year's, and it might be a easy thing to glance over, but if they had to sit there and type it out every year, when they hit those buzzwords, right, they might be like, oh, maybe we should change this, right? And so when you get 2025, it'll be interesting if those numbers shift. That's what I've been thinking the whole time. But
yeah, no, I think, and there's like, I know Christina is really interested. We've been working on that question in the community foundation space, because there's already some indication that not even on 990 forms, like on organizational websites and other public-facing things that organizations are pulling back from DEI statements. So yeah, it will absolutely be interesting to see what happens here, how like the distribution of resources and capacity maybe shifts over time. I mean, it's going to be easier for some organizations than others, because if you are the Association of Black Engineers, like that might be a bigger investment, right? That's not a mission change, it's a name change. And maybe you don't want to pull back from that space for reasons that I think are probably also obvious. So I think that's going to be interesting, and that's why we're interested to see how applying the code book is a little bit more conceptual, like being able to use a large language to apply that, which we've been experimenting with a different project, versus just using a keyword approach. Because a keyword approach requires that the language be relatively stable. Whereas with large language models, then you can have language that is like adjacent to what they were originally using, and you're still kind of okay. But yeah, looking at the language, but then also, as Long was saying, of these organizations, like of the EIMs, right, the organizations that we identified last time, do those get classified in different ways over years? Yeah.
Another nice thing about you relying on 990 data is that you have access to pretty detailed financial data of these organizations. So I think one of the next 10 papers you can write after this would be to really look into that, like to compare their financial size, but also like sources of funding and everything to see how those things vary based on these types of governance.
Yeah. So those are when I'm talking about resources, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Like and I think we're interested. We can look at it certainly by like approaches, like the distribution of resources across approaches and roles, but then also I think these profiles or these clusters are going to be probably maybe even more helpful for thinking about that. Like if there are, larger organizations, that are taking a tools-based approach and doing and engaged in knowledge creation. Again, I think there's going to be huge concentration here when it comes to equity and justice, and for the education organizations, it would be direct individual expression, social capital, right, is how they would show up. I would expect that to be really minimal, right, compared to this. And so the title, the very long title at the beginning, had implications at the end of it, because while we're not measuring outcomes, I think we can discuss implications of that, right? Like, there really is a lot of discussion in the AI governance literature about stakeholder engagement, and especially engaging marginalized stakeholder groups. I think that it's really easy to say. It's another thing when you actually look at the capacity of these organizations to do that, compared to organizations that are not focused on that, like, kind of at all.
Again, the point about resources, right? They can say that in that statement, but how much of their budget are they actually allocating towards those activities?
Well, there's but I'm talking about even the researchers making those prescriptions, right? Like we can count on civil society to do this. Just like, there's a similar argument that's often made. Well, if government cuts back on local services, nonprofits are going to step in, and that just isn't borne out by the data. These organizations don't have the capacity to do that.
So to that point, you talked about the government and nonprofits, but private industry too. And if you're looking longitudinally and kind of seeing where the trends go, you kind of have to know what they're doing too.
Yeah, so there are other researchers who that is their focus, and it would be interesting to collaborate with them. But I think we just hadn't seen people doing anything with nonprofits, and we thought that was a really important missing piece to the puzzle.
I'm particularly interested in the last 2 points, human rights and the environment. As for the human rights, in environmental governance, that's my area. Access to safe water is considered a basic human right. So I'm wondering whether it is going to a similar direction in the context of AI. I'm wondering whether those documents are framing AI use as more of a basic human right, or more of a skill that can empower the disadvantaged groups. And as for environmental sustainability, more and more environmental scholars are aware of this problem, like the huge consumption of electricity by the data centers, which are aggravating water scarcity in some regions. So, environmental sustainability is more than that. That's just an example. So I'm wondering what's in your agenda for the environmental part.
So, I mean, you can see here, it's like 1% of our data right now. So for this year, there was very low representation. And like I said, I would absolutely expect, because of the kinds of shifts that you're pointing to, that there will be higher representation here over time. And we labeled it environment to be kind of as broad as possible, right? Based on the patterns that we saw in the language that US nonprofits were using, even connecting this to human rights issues, I would expect that less than maybe discussion about talking about this in terms of access to water or threats to like people not having any say in what happens with the local power grid. And we're starting to hear some of that also in the news play out. But it will be really interesting to see what language they do end up using in this space. I mean, another thing that would be interesting is connecting with scholars in Europe to see differences, right? Because there, I would absolutely expect there to be a human rights framing in terms of environment, and the equity justice framing probably would be second to more of a human rights framing. Because the few organizations where we did see human rights is organizations that had much more of an international focus. So they're working in the global south, and that was kind of how they were thinking about their work.
Is that a dimension that you'll look at for the
future?
No, I mean when you're looking at buckets, you're going to say how much of their focus is on the US versus international.
We did not.
Can you get that from the 990 data?
I mean, we would have to develop a different code book for how to do that, because there are places where you could, although there's an NTE code that is international focus, and so you could at least get it through that. But
it's pretty inaccurate.
that's what I would guess, because the NTE codes are, right?
Do they have a surface area field in I-90? Do they provide any open text?
Some organizations specify
Is there,
which geographic region they focus on.
Yeah, isn't there a field that's something about geographic region?
But it's not a required.
It's an optional field.
I think we might actually have better luck thinking about the missions that we coded.
Yeah.
If we just did an automated content analysis of people talking about every single other country in the world and mapping it that
And
way.
international, say international or global.
A lot of them specify the specific countries, yeah, because in the activity descriptions, they don't say international work, they say we were working in blah, blah, blah. And so I would trust that a little bit more than use of the word international. Because international also is
APAM's an international association.
Yeah, international standards organization.
Yeah.
We're an international membership. Yeah, international membership. Right?
Yeah.
And so, but if they're specifically talking about different countries, then that could be a proxy. But again, there's so much nuance in the language. This is why we went through this qualitative process. Right? So I think we're at
this was great.